Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you some tips, tricks, and techniques on using with your watercolor pencils. I have to admit, watercolor pencils are still a little tricky for me, but I want to share some things that work for me whenever I am using them. The first thing that I want to go over is you have to use the right kind of paper. I tried watercolor paper on like mixed media paper and that kind of thing. These really work the best on watercolor paper and on the textured side of the watercolor paper. So I have Arteza watercolor paper here. They work beautifully with that. I also have the Canson watercolor paper. That's a little bit of a lighter watercolor paper. But I'm actually going to be using a new watercolor paper today, and that is the Ken Oliver watercolor paper. So I really love this one because it is super white compared to my Arteza watercolor paper. It also has a bit of a different texture, whereas the Arteza has more of a canvas texture. The Ken Oliver has more of a true watercolor texture. It also has a smooth side if you want to use that for stamping with a different project. Something else to consider whenever you are working with watercolor pencils is the water brush you are using. So you can use a regular watercolor brush that you dip in water. I prefer water brushes. That's what I prefer, but brushes are one of those things that's going to be different for each person. Also, a good pencil sharpener is something that you need when working with any kind of pencils, but watercolor pencils too. You want a nice sharp point. I love the one that I've used for about 5 years now, and I will have that link down in the description box below. So like I said, my watercolor pencils tend to work better on the textured side of the watercolor paper. I want to show you how they look on the smooth side though first, so I'm going to go ahead and test these out. As I am testing these out though, I want to stress that whenever you use watercolor pencils, you want to use a very light touch. Just like with regular pencils, you do not want to put an indentation into the paper. As soon as you do that, the pigment is going to get stuck in that indentation and you won't be able to blend it out. So here you can see I went ahead and kind of blended that out on the smooth side, but I still have a patch where it shows exactly where that first color was. Now you can fix that just by going over the top of that wet, but still it has just that little bit of trouble blending out on the non-textured side of the paper. So I tend to like to use the textured side of the paper whenever I am using watercolored pencils. That can be a problem whenever you're stamping though if you don't have a stamp positioner. So if you don't have a stamp positioner and you prefer stamping on the smooth side, just know that you're still going to have a little bit of pigment where you put it down first. Now here is the textured side. I'm going to switch up the colors to a blue and just show you how this works on the textured side. I'm again using a very light hand and circular motions. You can see how light of a touch and how little pigment I am putting on the paper. But when I bring the water to it, it really brightens up that color and just kind of works out to where it becomes really vibrant. I'm also able to blend this pretty far out, and I don't have as harsh of a line where that first color was put down. Now the great thing about watercolor pencils are there are a lot of techniques that you can use them with. So the first time I put down my color dry, but then once it was wet on the paper, I can go right back in and add some more color on top of that. When the paper is wet, it's going to be a more intense color going down, but it's also not going to blend out as easily. So keep that in mind, but it's a great way to add some depth. Now you can also dip the tip of the pencil into water and then color onto the paper that way. This doesn't last very long whenever you do this. You get a really intense color as soon as you bring it to the paper. This is great for adding little details here and there. But whenever you put the color down while it's wet, it does have a little bit of trouble blending out, so keep that in mind. Now something else you can do is take color directly from the tip. Now if you want no semblance of where you put down color with the tip of your pencil, this is the way to go. Take that color directly from the lead of the pencil. This is going to act more like a true watercolor, and it goes on very bright, very pigmented, depending on how much water you have on your brush. Now, like I said before, the main focus that you want to really be focused on whenever you're using your pencils is to use a light touch. Here, I used a little bit of a harsher touch, and then I'll come over to the right-hand side and use a lighter touch. You see not much pigment is going down whenever I use that lighter touch, but remember, you can build up layers with your pencils. But whenever you go in really hard and make those indentations into the paper, those indentations are there. That pigment is stuck in those indentations. You can see it doesn't really blend out. You get those really harsh lines. So a light touch, a very soft hand, and really just graze over the paper. That's going to get you the results that you want. You can see definitely the difference between the two there. I think that was my problem when I first started with watercolor pencils. I want that payoff immediately, but it just doesn't work that way with pencils. You kind of have to be patient. You kind of have to work up and build up that color. And again, if you don't want any of those lines, just come in and grab the color straight from the lead. Now that I've went over kind of all the basics that I know about, I'm sure there are a ton more out there. I am just a card maker though, but I'm going to go ahead and color on my project and use all of those techniques coloring in my little stamped image. So I am using the Martha Flowers stamp set from Joy Claire Stamps. It has these beautiful large floral bouquets in it, and I'm going to use this one with the little feathers in it. I think they're adorable. Like I said before, though, I am stamping on the textured side of the paper. So for that reason, I really prefer to use my stamp positioner. I'm using my Misty here. And you want to make sure that you're using the right ink whenever you stamp your images. I love the VersaFine Clear in Nocturne for stamping any image that I want to watercolor. You want to make sure that your ink is going to be waterproof. So just keep that in mind as you choose what ink to use as you stamp your image. I'm going to ink this up and stamp it down onto the left side of my card panel here. And this is the Ken Oliver watercolor paper that I'm stamping on. Again, stamping on that textured side. And because I'm using my Misty, I'm going to be able to stamp this 2, even 3, 4 times if I needed to. And I know it's going to be in exactly the same position. So you can see when I lift this up, not the greatest the first time, that's okay. I'll just ink it right back up and stamp it down again. I am getting a nice buildup of ink here, but that also means that I need to let it dry for a little bit. You can set this aside and let it dry completely, or you can hit it with your heat tool and give it a good heat set so you know it's not going to smear. Now it's on to the coloring. I'm going to start with the succulent off to the right hand side, and I am putting down the color where I want it the darkest, so right at the base of those leaves. I don't want to color in the entire area with the lead of the pencil. I just want the color where it's the darkest, because when I add the water to it, it's going to help spread that color out. And having that just on the place where I want it the darkest is going to give me a lot of different colors and a lot of different color payoff for just having one pencil on my project. Now, once I had all of the color on the base of those leaves, I'm going to bring in my water brush. I don't have a ton of water on this. I like to dab it off onto a cloth before I bring it to the paper, and I'll just use whatever leftover water is on that to help fan out that color towards the ends or the tips of the leaves. And that is just one pencil, but it still gives me all those different gradients of that one color just by having the color placed at the base of the leaf and nowhere else. And remember, whenever I put this color down, I used a very light hand and used circular motions to put that color down. I didn't use a ton of pressure, and because of that, it's going to blend out really well and not leave any indentations on my paper. I still wanted to deepen up some of those areas, so while it was still a little damp, I'm coming in with my pencil again and adding that color. This is going to give me just darker places and really intensify that lead as it goes onto the paper, and it's going to create a really nice dark rich green, and I can still blend it out a little bit. It's not going to blend as easily as if it were dry, but it will blend out a little bit. Again, make sure you're using that light touch as you put it onto the paper. Now on each leaf, I also wanted to add a little bit of purple just to the tips of the leaves. You can see I started kind of doing that here, but I wanted it to be really saturated with color, and get a really good color payoff, but just in the tiniest little space. So what I did was I dipped the tip of that pencil in water and then brought it over and colored just in the tips of those leaves. That gives me that really, really rich and bold color. The thing is it doesn't last a super long time. Your lead doesn't stay wet for a long time, so you will need to keep re-dipping it, and then you'll kind of feel when the water runs out and when you need to go back in and re-dip, so you get that nice saturation of color. But that is the best way to get the most intense color in those really tiny areas. One thing you'll notice about my stamped image too is all of the areas that I am coloring in are relatively small. If you are just starting out with watercolor pencils and you're just trying to get a feel for them, I would suggest smaller images. Having large open areas to color in can be really intimidating. It can also show your lines really, really badly. But when you have these smaller areas, it is much more inviting and it's not so intimidating to look at these smaller areas where there's not a ton of white space. Having a large area with all that white space can just be too overwhelming, especially when you're just starting out with the coloring medium. So I went ahead and colored in all of the rest of the images just by coloring onto the paper and blending out those areas. Sometimes I added a little more darker areas with a darker color, but really all of the rest of those images I colored in the exact same way. I am going to show you the last kind of technique that I use with my watercolor pencils, and that is taking the color directly from the tip. Now, you can use this to create some really intense colors, or you can use it to create some really nice washes like I'm using here. I wanted a nice blue kind of haze around this entire image, but I didn't want to come in directly from the lead because I didn't want any of those markings from the pencil that you can get. Even if you use the softest touch, I find that I still have some of those markings left over, no matter how soft of a touch I use and how well and how much water I use to blend that out. So when I want just that nice soft wash, I'll come in directly from the tip and use it kind of like I would a pan watercolor coming off of a palette. Just think of it like that. You're just taking it directly from the tip of the brush. Now, once that was done, that was all the coloring there was on this card. Super simple and easy to do, and relatively easy techniques. You just have to take your time and use that nice soft touch. And there it is. I'm really happy with the way this turned out, especially because I haven't played with my watercolor pencils in months. Really months. And I just did a little test practice on that succulent, and then I came in and colored in the entire image, and I'm really happy with the way this one turned out after not playing around with this coloring medium for a while. What I'm going to do to finish off this card is super simple too, but I wanted to share this little trick with you. I'm using the Hello Sentiment stamp set. It's a great sentiment stamp set that you can build up. I'm using that very scripty hello in the top right hand corner on that same panel that I did my coloring on. Now again, I stamped on my textured panel, and that was fine with my not solid images that kind of had a sketchy look to them to begin with. But this hello is pretty solid and pretty bold. So I'm going to stamp this. I bet I stamped it 4 times and I still couldn't get just that solid impression. There were just a few little spots. So what I like to do is just come in with a black marker and fill those in. It's going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of pushing with your MISTI to try and get all those little holes filled in. But I had a nice solid image just by filling in those with a little black marker. So I finished off this panel by putting it on a craft mat and attaching that to an A2 side folding card base that I'm using horizontally. And then I just added a few little black irresistible dots. That irresistible picot embellishment is from Imagine. It's a great one to use if you have trouble with clogs like I do on other brands. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you guys found this video helpful. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, you can do that over on the left-hand side. Don't forget all the information, including the supplies, in the description box below. Happy crafting, everyone!